Atlantis. The idea of a rich and powerful island civilization that perished in a sudden cataclysm has been man's imagination ever since Atlantis was first mentioned in the writings of Plato. Accumulated scientific and archaeological evidence now indicates that the lost continent may have been located on the islands of Crete and Thera, which were devastated by volcanic eruptions in about 1450 BC. Recent archaeological discoveries on Thera, including surprisingly beautiful frescoes, add to the compelling evidence of a peaceful ancient civilization which responds in many striking respects of Plato's description of Atlantis. Although the number of books that have been written about Atlantis could fill a small library, they are all based on a single literary source, the Platonic dialogues. Timaeus and Critias, Plato, 427 to 347 BC, was related through his mother's family to Solon, the Athenian poet and socio-economic reformer who became chief magistrate of Athens in 594 BC. Solon had learned the story of Atlantis from a priest of Neith, the equivalent of the Greeks' Athena, while visiting Egypt, and it was passed down in the family of Plato. The Timaeus and Critias contain the essence of the Atlantis legend. Long before the classical Greek civilization of Solon time, another civilization existed on the Greek mainland. This earlier civilization had a powerful rival in the great and wonderful island empire of Atlantis, an empire that was at first a veritable model of the ideal commonwealth. In time, however, it became corrupted and endeavored to subjugate and enslave the rest of the world. The Greeks defeated the Atlanteans, but afterwards there were violent earthquakes and floods. In a single night and day of disaster, the island of Atlantis disappeared into the depths of the sea. According to the narrative, the main island of Atlantis was fashioned by a sea god Poseidon, also known as the Earthshaker, whose cult was intimately associated with the bull. The island, clearly volcanic in origins, was shaped by Poseidon into alternating belts of sea and land. The Atlanteans bridged over the sea zones surrounding the ancient metropolis, making a road to and from the royal palace in the center. They bored a canal 300 foot feet wide, 100 feet deep, and 5.5 miles long from the innermost circular channel to the open sea. Since the banks of the canal were a considerable distance above the water, the Atlanteans were able to cover over the channels and still leave room for ships to maneuver. The schematic of the ancient metropolis prepared from the description of Critias is shown at the right. Its splendor, Atlant- its splendor described by Plato in great detail, indicates that the Atlanteans were wealthy, probably from the proceeds of a lucrative maritime traffic. The rest of the country, the so-called royal state, is said to have been a large, roughly rectangular plain, 2,000 by 3,000 stadia, about 340 by 230 miles. The exact geographical relationship between the ancient metropolis or royal city and the royal state is not clear in the narrative. The empire is described as being ruled by a royal house of princes, all descended from a common ancestry and bound never to take up arms against each other. Even fifth and sixth year alternately, the reign the reigning members of the royal family left their cities to the plain and gathered in the ancient metropolis to deliberate on matters of common interest. These meetings were accompanied by an elaborate ritual comprising the sacrifice of a bull which had to be captured with the use of staves and nooses only. The sacred bulls were free to range the temple of Poseidon. Is the Atlantis story fact or fancy? Both views have been argued with equal eloquency, ingenuity, and conviction. From almost 2,500 years, Aristotle's 384 3 to 322 BC dismissed the Atlantis legend as pure fantasy. He believed that Plato made up the story because he found it useful in expounding his ideas on ideal government, and that having created it, he made it disappear in a catalysm, so to so as not to have to account for its whereabouts. But there is no need to suppose that just because the tale served Plato's philosophical purposes, it had been fabricated out of whole cloth. Indeed, it has been taken seriously by at least as many people as rejected it. The first strong hint that the tale might not be more fabricated came with the spectacular exploits of Heinrich Schliemann, Schliemann 1822-1890, a German businessman who became one of the founders of modern scientific field archaeology. At an early age, he became fascinated with the epic of Homer, which described a civilization of Greeks prior to that of Plato. At the time he read them, the Iliad and the Odyssey were mostly regarded as works of pure fiction. Schliemann became convicted, convinced that they really related historical events, and he resolved to prove it. To prove it, in 1872 he found, or thought he did, ancient Troy, whose surge is the subject of the Iliad. In fact, in his impatience, he had cut through Homer's city to a much earlier Troy. In 1876, Schliemann began excavating at Mycenae, 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 Mycenae in Greece and was immediately successful. You should check the pronunciation for the word Mycenae, Mycenae, to pronounce it correctly. The so-called shaft graves he found there yielded an enormous wealth of spectacular finds. He thought he had found the city and palace of Agamemnon, the king of men, who was the leader of the Greek host that sailed against Troy. But again Schliemann had a read mid-success. The graves were 300 to 400 years older than Agamemnon could ever been. Schliemann was followed by other archaeologists whose work related a highly advanced ancient civilization. Why Atlantis? Nicolas Tschoegl, Tschoegl, professor of chemical engineering, has, in addition to writing Atlantis, Crandall of Western civilization, spoken several times over the past year to students, alumni, and the general public about Atlantis. He talk at his talk at Backman Auditorium last month drew more people than any other lecture ever given there. Packed Ramo Auditorium for the piped-in version without the slides and graphics. He left hundreds of people outside and left 100 people outside. The phenomenon gives rise to a number of questions. Why is the subject of Atlantis so interesting to so many people? In fact, why is Tschoegl interested, and why did he decide to give the lecture? How, as a chemical engineer and scientist, does he feel qualified to lecture and write about something so far removed from his particular specialty? The study of synthetic material, in particular synthetic rubber. Tschoegl believes that the law of Atlantis is partly a general fascination with the mysterious and partly a desire on the part of some people to find simple answers to the complex problem facing us. For some, Atlantis is in the same category of UFO, UFOs, unidentified flying objects. He says both good both go back to the same common root, the feeling that perhaps at some earlier age we had the secret of living together peacefully, and somehow the secret got lost. By rediscovering Atlantis, dubbed Mycenaeans from its chief archaeological site. Just before the outbreak of World War II, numerous clay tables written in the Linear B script were found at the excavation of the palace of King Nestor near Messenia in Greece. The deciphering of the script in 1953 showed that the Mycenaeans were Greek. The civilization that this archaeological work uncovered is in all essential details identical with that of Homer's Greece. Thus, at least the Greek part of the Atlantis legend had been vindicated. Long before the Greek classical period, there was indeed another practically forgotten period of high civilization in Greek history. What about the location of Atlantis? Plato unmistakably put it in the Atlantic Ocean, but what we now know about the topography of the Atlantic makes it virtually impossible to believe that an island empire could have existed in this ocean in anything like historic times. In addition, because of the unbelievable logistics of conducting a war over such vast distances, it would make much more sense to seek Atlantis rather closer to the Greek homeland. One possibility in Crete, its relation to the Greek mainland and the nearby island of Thera is illustrated above, and the beginning of its century. Archaeologists, foremost among them Arthur Evans, 1851-1951, excavator of the palace of Monos and Knossos, unearthed on Crete what appeared to be another highly advanced civilization, somewhat older and artistically more refined and more original than the Mycenaean. An example of some of the delicately executed art of this civilization is illustrated at to the right. Evans called this civilization, which was destroyed around 1450 BC, Minoan. Evidence of the Minoan outposts have since been discovered on many Aegean islands and as far away as Sicily and perhaps Spain. But the notion that Atlantis just had to have been in the Atlantic Ocean was so firmly rooted in the minds of so many people that the establishment of a connection between Atlantis and the Minoan culture was surprisingly slow in coming. Another reason for the lag was that for a long time remains of the Minoan civilization were found essentially only on Crete, and Crete was still there. It was it certainly had to disappear into the sea. In 1930, the British archaeologist K.T. Frost published a paper identifying the Minoan civilization and Crete with Atlantis, but although he argued convincingly and compellingly, his thesis was ignored by archaeologists. Still unexplained remains remained still unexplained remained the causes for the sudden decline of Minoan civilization, which had been noted by Evans, and its replacement by the Mycenaeans. In 1939, while excavating Amnisos, the ancient harbor of Knossos, the Greek archaeologist Spyridon Marinetos became convinced that he had found the clue to the sudden catastrophe that befell the Minoan civilization. He believed it was a consequence of a gigantic eruption of the volcano on the island of Thera, about 70 miles northeast to Crete. At the time, archaeologists generally believed that the Minoan civilization was destroyed by conquest from the mainland. Marinatos published his revolutionary ideas in the respected British journal Antiquity, but the outbreak of World War II and the subsequent civil strife in Greece prevented any further work. When archaeological and scientific work was resumed in about 1955, startling results were obtained in quick succession. In particular, the Greek seismology A.G. Gallinopoulos connected the Minoan civilization with Atlantis. The Marinatos had also come to the same conclusion. Why Atlantis continued? This Atlantis, many people believe we will find the secret again. In the same way, some believe a race of beings in some far galaxy has the secret and will deliver it to us someday. But for Tschoegl, the fascination has a much more rational and factual basis. The theories and evidence that seem to connect the mystical Atlantis with the historical Minoan civilization are appealing to me because they order my personal universe a little more. Something that was hitherto incomprehensible now finds its proper niche in the scheme of things. One reason he decided to give the Beckman lecture was his desire to clear away some of the mysticism about Atlantis. Another reason, he says, has to do with the purpose of the Beckman lecture, which has always been to present Caltech and its faculty to the general public, not only through discussions of their work, but through the personalities of the scientists as human beings. He believes the images that needs to be projected is the real one of man, which with interest and social concerns that go beyond their narrow specialties rather than the distorted, but all too prevalent one of a bunch of mad scientists huddled in their laboratories plotting how either to save or destroy mankind. Testowigl is a good example of the scientist who is both a specialist and a generalist. He knows a good deal about chemical engineering because that is the way I earn my living. But science and engineering are only two of his many activities and interests. Archaeology, linguistics, and the art of history or foreign cultures are others. This variety is perhaps a result of his classical European education in the rich high school. In the high school, in the high school he attended in Hungary, science was more was no more important than any other subject, and much emphasis was given to languages, history, and literature. I was about 14 years old when I came across a book that showed a color plate of the palace of Minos at Knossos on the island of Crete. The palace was going up in flames. I wanted to understand the fate of the strange and exciting culture that created so many beautiful things. I wanted to know why such a beauty was destroyed. Knowing the result, that is the reason, I thought would put things right for me somehow. So when I saw an exhibit on the Pharaoh excavation in Athens last summer, I realized I might have found an answer. Although he admits to no qualifications on this subject other than an extensive amount of reading, Testowigl resolved then and there to present a Beckman lecture on the archaeological work being done on Crete and Terra. One reason of his lecture is interest on the part of some Caltech chemists and geologists in contributing their skills and determining of whether determining of whether the Atlantis Crete Pharaoh theory is true. Meanwhile, Testowigl is thinking about presenting another lecture at some future date, this time on the topic that combines his interest in cultural anthropology and his pa- specialty in chemical engineering. The proposed title is A Cultural History of Rubber. Since there appears to be an important clue to the whole mystery, let us have a closer look at it. Thera, illustrated above, is a small volcanic island group about 5 miles in diameter, one of the Cyclades Islands in the southern part of the Aegean Sea. The volcano on Thera is active, a minor eruption having occurred as recently as 1956. The work of volcanologists Rack in Germany, the Hessen, and Ninkovich of Columbia University's Lamont Geological Observatory in this country has shown that the island volcano underwent major eruptions in about 25,000 BC and again about 1450 BC when Minoan civilization was at its height. Volcanic ash thrown up during the later eruption was as much as 1,000 feet deep on Terra, and the lesser amount was scattered over a wide geographic area on the Aegean. The eruption of 1450 BC is estimated to have been 4 to 5 times as powerful as a well-documented eruption of Krakatoa in the Indian Ocean. In 1883, the sound of Krakatoa's explosion was heard as far away as 3,000 miles. Ashfall was recorded over distances of 2,000 miles, and particulate matter from the eruption circled the Earth for many years. The map of page 18 indicates the approximate area over which the blast was felt. This truly gigantic explosion, several times more powerful than that of the largest nuclear bomb ever exploded, surely affected the entire Aegean world. The accompanying earthquakes and tidal waves and the ensuing inflation destroyed Minoan palaces and cities all over the island. Many of the inhabitants and the animals of which their livestock depended were killed. Crete must have been recovered with ash smothering vegetation, rendering wells useless and blocking irrigation canals. For many years, Crete must have been a shambles, a Minoan civilization destroyed at its base. Life soon reasserted itself. However, Mycenaean Greece moved into a powerful vacuum. Linear B tables written in Mycenaean Greek have been found in Knossos. The Homeric epics dealing with events about 2000 years after the eruption, about 1200 BC, describes Crete as again rich and powerful. The Mycenaean ruler of Crete, Idomenios, is listed by Homer as one of the most powerful among the Greek kings who fought at Troy about 100 years after the Trojan War. 1000 BC, a Dark Ages period that lasted several hundred years, descended under the Aegean world. The reason for this decline are not clear. It may have been due to a long-lasting climatic change, but classical Greek civilization began to emerge about 700 BC. Since nothing was known in either Ceylon or Plato, Greek contem- contemporary contemporaries about neither Mycenaean or Minoan culture, they could not imagine that the events the Egyptian priests described could have happened too close to home. Plato reports the priests as saying that Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years before Solon's time, about 12,000 years ago. This is plainly impossible, for no trace has ever been found of any advanced civilization that flourished that long ago. Galanopoulos, the Greek seismologist who had made a special study on the Atlantean problem in relation to a volcanic study in the Aegean, has pointed out that whenever Plato mentions figures involving the number 1000, they do not make any sense. They appear too large by a factor of 10. The conjecture is that somewhere in the transmission of the record of Plato, the numeral for 1000 became confused with that 400. Thus, the Atlanteans' host is given as numbering 1,200,000. 1/10 of this 120,000 is still larger, but it seems a more reasonable number when we consider that the entire population of the Mediterranean region at the time was scarcely more than that of New York City now. If the disruption if the disruption of Atlantis is accordingly taken to have occurred 900 and not 9,000 years before Solon's, the date of the catastrophe becomes 500, 1500 BC. It is difficult to be exact about when the Thera eruption took place, but that it was about 1450 BC is currently accepted. The correct immediate The correction immediately makes sense with respect to the size of the royal state. It, if this is reduced from 2000 by 3000 stadia, roughly the size of California, to 200 by 300, the dimensions almost perfectly fit that part of Crete. The plain of Messara, the Minoan sites have been excavated. This is illustrated above. What about the royal city or ancient metropolis? Gallienopoulos has advanced the bold idea that the ancient metropolis has to be sought not in Crete but in Thera. According to this idea, the island group, including Thera, was the real center of the Minoan or Atlantean Empire. The ancient metropolis thus becomes completely destroyed in the eruption. The theory has gained even more credence as a result of the recent excavation by Marinatus and others of the of a Minoan town on Thera with a level of sophistication similar to that of the civilization on Crete, an intact city of two and three-story houses is still standing under the volcanic ash. Thus, another Pompeii, some 1,500 years older than its Italian counterpart, is emerging on this Aegean island. To make their buildings elastic and earthquake resistant, the the Therians or Atlanteans set wooden pits in the corner points of the stones. They cultivated the olive and produced pottery similar to that found in Knossos, but by far the most amazing creation of the ancient islanders were their frescoes, such as the one below. Beyond any doubt, they surpassed all contemporary art found so far in the Mediterranean region. The frescoes at Knossos, for example, are less delicate, free-flowing, and rhythmically than these. These show Bronze Age civilization at its peak. Such exquisite art could have been executed only by professional artists who could only have been sustained by a rather high level of civilization. These discoveries are exciting because of what they tell us about the possible origin of Western civilization. Our North American culture has its roots in Eastern European culture. The civilization of Europe is founded on the classical Greek culture of Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, which in turn has its roots in the preceding Mycenaean culture, and the Mycenaeans are intertwined with the Minoan culture. It is If it is proven that the Minoan and Atlantean civilization are one and the same, then Thera, the site of the royal city of Atlantis, may have been the true birthplace of our own civilization. The end.